When people ask me, what's so special about First Baptist on Fifth? I answer quickly. It's not our building, though lovely, or our worship, though meaningful, not our gatherings, though life-giving, or even our missions and ministries in the world, though impactful. The very best part of First on Fifth? Our people, hands down. In our Confession of Identity, we said this of our community. Here, you'll see retirees and families with rambunctious little ones, teenagers discovering their identities, middle-agers juggling all the demands of this season, young people navigating adulthood for the first time, and seniors rich in wisdom and encouragement. You can read our fiery op-eds in the paper, pass us moving about on the city streets, see us building ramps for the underserved, catch us finding beauty in our gardens and on hiking trails, and experience us taking delight in the world. At the core of our community, we are folks who love each other well. And at the core of our life together, we share in meaningful conversation about what it means to live and love in this world. That's what you'll hear and who you'll hear from in our new podcast series called Life Together. Each episode will be hosted by one of our ministers and will feature a conversation with one or two or even several of our beloved church members. They'll answer a handful of questions about their story, about objects or artifacts that represent their journey, about questions or doubts they wrestle with, and why they are a member, and finally, what gives them hope. As you listen to their wisdom and laughter, their audacious hope and abundant love, I trust you'll be as inspired and moved as I am on the regular. T.S. Eliot once asked, "What life have you if you have not life together?" Join us this season for Life Together.
Hello, friends, and welcome to First Baptist on Fifth Life Together podcast series. Thank you for listening. We are glad to have David and Joani Hughes in conversation with us today. David has a unique relationship with First Baptist in that he served as senior pastor here for 22 years, from 1991 to 2013, and it was my privilege to serve with David on the pastoral staff 16 of those 22 years. And you were instrumental in my journey in coming to Winston-Salem from Texas. As a matter of fact, you came and had beef barbecue with me and Hal Smith in Texas, and that was the beginning of it all. Joani had a full career as a public school teacher, teaching fourth grade, most of it in Winston-Salem Forsyth County schools. So I'm sure there's many folks who know of you as Mrs. Hughes. That's all they know you as. Exactly. Joani was ordained as a deacon at First Baptist, and I think that's somewhat unique to your journey as a pastor's spouse to become a deacon in a Baptist church. So maybe we'll explore that some in this conversation. We have a series of questions that we hope will give a glimpse into your spiritual lives and your life as a part of this beloved community at First on Fifth. So the first question, tell us your story, particularly the people, places, or season of life that have most powerfully shaped for good or ill your understanding of God or self.
I'll start out with that. It's instructive to know that I came up in a church staff member's home. I was raised in a home that was Baptist, Southern Baptist at the time. Our entire life was church. Probably a little bit more than it should have been, but that's all we did. That's all I knew.
Your
was
dad
church.
was a pastor
My
in
dad was
Greensboro.
the minister of education at a church in Greensboro. For the most part, it was very positive until high school, and I had an experience in high school that was very wounding, and the response of the church was very wounding. And I had an opportunity to, I could have left the church entirely. I felt very abandoned by the church. I did not feel abandoned by God. Fortunately, I went to Wake Forest and encountered people who knew me well, who loved me well, and loved me back into a loving relationship with the church. Part of that happened here as I attended the college Sunday school class at this church. So my walk as a Christian in the church has had ups and downs, but overall I feel like I have been loved well by the church, and I'd love the church very much now.
That says a lot as a child of a staff member in a church. I think we can all relate to
That comes fraught. It's potential is there.
David, what about you?
Yeah, well, like Joani, I'm the product of a family very involved in church. Again, a Southern Baptist church. And there are several points along the way where I could land on this question, because a number of people have mentored me and helped me in my development. I think the people and the experience that most define who I find myself to be now would be centered in the Transforming Center, which is a ministry located in Chicago that I became involved with in 2007. And at that point in my life and ministry, I was really burned out, not just by ministry as we would normally do it, but by a campaign that you remember well, David, that we did that involved a lot of layers of work. And but I went into that with very little margin, and what little margin I had got filled up real fast. So the campaign itself was fine. It was successful, but it left me pretty empty and tired. Fortunately, we had invited a speaker to come to our church to speak to us about not just renovation of buildings, but of our hearts and our souls. Her name was Ruth Haley Barton. Mm-hmm. She came and spent a weekend with us, and out of that weekend came an invitation from her for me to participate in the ministry of the Transforming Center, and I entered into a cohort, which we call a community. It was a 2-year experience that was life-changing for me, and then began to serve as a volunteer and then as a board member. And finally, in 2013, stepped away from being a pastor here to work with Ruth and that ministry. That, for the first time in my life, gave me a structured pathway of formation, which for whatever reason, through many years in church and 7 years of theological education, had just been left out. So that was very formative for me, and to this day still explains now who I am in Christ. I still value all the church experience I've had, but that one in particular stands out.
And you did retire from pastoral ministry here, but you went right into work with the Transforming Center and really continuing a ministry.
Yes. So, I talked about it as though I retired from here, but I have not retired from ministry at all. You're right. I began working full-time for the Transforming Center as their first executive director. Did it remotely before that was as normal as it is now. Continued to live here in Winston-Salem. And then the organization grew to the point that it no longer made sense for an executive director to live elsewhere. So my role changed. These days, I'm a part-time contractor for the Transforming Center, also a spiritual director, and Joani is that as well. And then I'm now doing a lot of consulting with churches and denominations. So still a lot going on in terms of ministry, and am a part of ministry here at First Baptist. Not in the business side, thanks be to God, but in the ministry side.
I think it's fascinating that both of you do something with spiritual direction now, don't you? And I wonder how your previous careers have prepared you for that. That's not one of the questions, but I wonder, I've heard it said about these transitions in our lives that in God's eyes, they're all seamless. And with us, they're major transitions, but for God is in seeing this bigger picture. What about for you, how you were prepared for the spiritual direction part of things through what your earlier careers were?
Spiritual direction for me was a very unexpected second career and has been so meaningful. I don't know in terms of how I was prepared. I mean, spiritual direction is wholly listening to another person and accompanying them on their journey. I don't know quite how to answer that question in terms of how they connect. I just know that it has been a wonderful discovery for me to see spiritual direction is something that I've been called to do.
Excellent.
Well, I would just say that God doesn't waste anything. You know, anything and everything is usable by God. In Joani's case, I know she has spent time with spouses of pastors. Well, Joani has plenty of experience that helps her with that. In my case, most of my directees are pastors. So, of course, my 37 years in the pastorate has been really helpful as I sit with pastors because they know that I know a little bit about what they're dealing with. So that's been very helpful. And yeah, it is a particular kind of listening to the directee and to the Holy Spirit at the same time. So all of your previous Christian experience and any experience you've had with listening comes into play in direction.
Thank you. If you had to choose 3 objects or artifacts that represent your journey of life and faith, what might they be?
We came prepared. This first one is a rock that was given to us when we got married. It has a little bride and groom and our name and our wedding date. David and I spent my senior year of college, his junior year. We did a January term at an experiment. What was it called?
Experiment in religious community.
Religious community. And there were about 15 of us that lived in the First Baptist Church Asheville Cottage up at Ridgecrest for the month. And that's where we kind of rediscovered each other. So that was the beginning of our relationship in a pretty pivotal month. One of the women that was on that experience with us went back up to the cabin, got this rock from the yard of the cabin, painted it for us, and gave it to us. So that's always been, for 50 years later, that's still significant. This is starfish. Our family is scattered, and the one time we're guaranteed to be together every year is at the beach. So this represents a good week with our family gathered. It's also it's the place that I come alive at the beach. That's significant to me. This candle represents spiritual direction. We light a candle just to remind us of the presence of the Spirit. So those are my 3 objects.
Fantastic.
So the first one I'll hold up is a bobblehead of a demon deacon from Wake Forest. I think about how I went to Wake, and I just sort of backed into it at the last minute, not having any idea how important that decision was. It's where I met my wife. It's where I started an educational route that took me into new places intellectually that I'd never been before. It introduced me to a whole new set of friends. In many ways, it was my first experience of community, particularly in a fraternity of all things. So, and to this day, our best friends are a part of the Wake Forest community. This week celebrate my 50th reunion at Wake. I'll be going to a bunch of stuff on campus this week. So as I look back on my life, Wake Forest was and still is a very influential part of my experience. Then one of the 3 for me is the same rock for all the reasons that Joani just explained. And interestingly enough, a former member of our church, Ralph Wood, and his wife, Suzanne, led this community. They're the ones that hosted it and led it. And one of the books that we read is Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Life Together, which we're now studying in our Sunday school class 53 years later, and is set the theme for this church in the fall. Then the other one for me is an icon. Like most Baptists, I had a lot of suspicion about icons. I was taught to avoid icons because they could become idols, the usual stuff that most of us heard in training union or wherever. But again, through the Transforming Center, I was reintroduced to icons and now see them as a wonderful tool for reflection and formation. And I'm glad that this congregation doesn't shy away from iconography and art, something that we got started some years ago. And it just symbolizes, again, my journey of formation. And this particular icon is meaningful to me. I don't know if it'll show up on the camera or not, because it shows John leaning against the chest of or leaning towards Jesus in kind of an embrace at the Lord's Supper. The beloved disciple, he's called, and it just represents the intimacy that is possible for us with Christ.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. What questions or doubts do you wrestle with most?
Thought about this. I mean, I could come up with a list, but the one that I think I want to mention now is I just wonder what we have done to this world environmentally. What is the world going to be like for our grandchildren? I wonder what we have done. I'm becoming increasingly convicted about that. And so doubt is that, I guess I have questions of how have we made such a mess of taking care of our world, and what do we need to do immediately?
And some of the recent creation studies we had here have opened our eyes to some of that. Yeah.
Reinforced what I was already thinking about. So that would be mine.
Good.
Yeah, one of mine builds off that, which is what kind of world are we leaving to our children and grandchildren? Things are really challenging right now, but we're in our 70s. We won't be around forever, but I do wonder over the next 30, 40, 50 years just what all is going to transpire in this country and the world through climate change and a lot of other things. The other thing that I wonder about a lot and ask God about is the complicity of the church in so many of our problems. Sad. I mean, the church, without the church, I don't know where we would be. The church has done so many wonderful things and still is. At the same time, it just feels like the church is a part of the problem. We have people involved in politics in a way that I think is not healthy. The church is now fragmented. The church is now antagonistic. The church is now viewed very negatively. The brand of the church, I'm afraid, has been damaged. I hope not irreparably, but as people watch people associated with church, how they behave, what they say in public spaces, it's very disturbing to me. And I wonder, with God, where this is all headed, and how, if Humpty Dumpty can be put together again. There's just a lot of breakage. And I don't know if there are some people, younger adults especially, that think the church just as it is needs to die and we need to start all over. I don't know that that's the answer. But I do have a lot of questions about the role the church has played. And in our case, we come from Southern Baptist roots, and all the way back to the fact that we started because of our support of slavery. And then, we could list a lot of other things. It's just a curiosity to me. I will say that I think one proof of the existence of God is there's still church.
God has a sense of humor, is that right?
It's still around despite everything.
Well, tell you this. We know the surface answer to this next question, but maybe there's more nuance to this. How or why did you come to be a member of First Baptist on Fifth? And maybe a question related to that is, how did you remain a member of First Baptist? Because it's pretty unusual for a person who served on staff in a church to remain a part of that congregation. So, give us an answer to that.
That's good.
Well, I'll start on that one. So I was serving as pastor of First Baptist Elkin, which is just a few miles up the road. And in 1989, I think, maybe 1990, I got a call one day from the chair of the pastor search committee here. And he wanted to know if I would be open to talking with the search committee of this church. What's ironic is that I had just done a wedding here at First Baptist in our sanctuary, along with my predecessor, Paul Craven. Paul ended his ministry here in a bad way. It did not end well. I remember sitting in that office just through this wall here with Paul. The office was full of boxes, and he was preparing to leave. And he was telling me his sad story about what happened to him here, and it was not pretty. And then I remember walking around the church. The hallways looked pretty bad. They hadn't been painted or touched in quite a while. And this is the gospel truth. I remember walking out of the building after the wedding was done because I knew Paul was leaving. And I remember thinking, I don't know who's going to come here next, but I feel sorry for whoever it is. That had just happened a few weeks before I got the call. So Joani and I had to sit and pray and ponder about whether or not we would even have a conversation. Well, we finally decided we would. And it was interesting. What happened next is that the search committee, because they were so close to where we lived, began to almost routinely visit our church. And it was the worst kept secret of all time that the search committee from First Baptist was attending our services. They didn't want to just hear one sermon. They wanted to hear a long series of sermons. Anyway, pretty soon we started to have heart-to-heart conversations. The search committee narrowed their search down to 4 people and then down to 2 people, and then eventually invited me to come and to talk with them about a call. And I did not preach a trial sermon. Instead, we had about a 2-hour forum with the church in which they asked me all kinds of questions. The sanctuary was full of people that wanted to ask me questions, and that was a very meaningful experience. And so in May of 1991, I started here as pastor. In April of 1991, a big stone fell out of the steeple to let us know that needed attention, which was just a symbol of things to come. and a symbol even to this day of things that tend to happen in this congregation. And then Joani and the kids followed that summer. I lived we had a missionary house at that point. I lived there until all of us moved to the first house that we lived in here. So that's how we got here.
And I'll add one thing about that forum. After David had talked for an hour, someone said, well, how do you feel about being a pastor's wife? And I thought, this is my moment. Don't blow it. So I said, I feel good about it, but you need to know that you would be hiring a pastor. You would not be hiring a pastor's wife, and that I hope to be involved, but I absolutely will not be here every time the door opens. And was pretty clear about that, more clear than I thought I planned to be. And it was very well received. There was no
Wow.
pushback at all on that.
Yeah. I was holding my breath a little bit on that, but it went over well. And that was a sign to us that this might work. As far as staying here, that's another interesting story. You know, our polity says nothing about what a retiring pastor can or cannot do, or should not do. There's zero guidance. So, after you're somewhere 22 years or even longer, as you've been, a community begins to feel like a family. And a big part of us hoped that we could find a way to stay here because we had no intention of moving from Winston-Salem. I did know, however, that I needed to leave for a while. And I did. I stepped away
About 2 years.
for about 2 years. I knew that I needed to be away during the interim, and then I needed to be away when the next pastor came to give that person a chance to just settle in. And then we would just see how things might go, and if we could figure out a way to be here meaningfully without being a hindrance or a problem. And I will just say from day one, Emily has been very gracious with me, to me, and making me feel welcome to stay. And we've had, I think, a really good relationship in the time she's been here. Joani, who was prevented from being a deacon because of being married to me, then that changed, and she's remained pretty close to the the workings of the church. I, on the other hand, have just decided to stay away from anything having to do with governance. I don't need to go to another deacon's meeting. I really don't. So I have found my place. I'm teaching a Sunday school class here. What's interesting is we've now been in the church 33 years. And so we have watched a lot change. And most recently, the fact that we could talk about our gay son and share that entire journey with the church really for the first time, which I think had some impact, at least, in the church changing its mind about being affirming or not. That's been a really special feature of being here this long. And so, yeah, we still continue to feel like this is our church home, our church family. Was it really weird at first to be on the periphery of something I was leading? Yes. It felt really odd, but I'm pretty much over that now. And so it feels good.
Well, I've been here, of course, 26 years and have seen you in other roles, both of you in other roles, but to see how you're held in such high esteem now and the role that you play, leading a small group, being a deacon, serving as a spiritual mentor to people and spiritual director to people, it really is a beautiful thing. So it's to see it from the big picture, the longer perspective, it's really something. The final question, what gives you hope right now?
There's a lot that gives me hope. I think, for me, I think watching people change over time, watching myself change over time, gives me hope that there is not a dead end. I believe
like
there are
that.
not situations that are dead ends. Ultimately, there is a way out. And being a part of that as a spiritual director, and then seeing that in my own life, seeing that in our life together, and in the life of this church, that's what gives me hope.
Fantastic.
Yeah, similarly, I think the whole formation movement that's going on in the church now gives me great hope. The fact that there is this hunger for God that is causing people to want to go deeper. Now, it's also causing people to drop out of church when they don't think the church is addressing it in any way. But there are a lot of people, and this is what I see through the ministry I've worked with in the Transforming Center, a lot of people are searching desperately for something more than they've experienced with their faith or with church. And then they're returning to where they've been serving or whatever, and are sharing that there. And so what Joani says about transformation, I completely agree. It is possible. And, the scripture says that nothing is too hard for God. Well, I hang a lot on that. Nothing is too hard for God. What looks impossible to us is not impossible to God. So I still think, the old adage that God does his best work in dark spaces, meaning like the tomb of Jesus, that resurrection can come out of tombs. I believe that. And I've seen that in my own life. I've seen that in others' lives. And that gives me hope. And I'm glad I have that hope, because without that, things could look pretty dark at times. But I've seen too much, experienced too much to give up.
Such a powerful word. Thank you all for sharing from your hearts.
Yeah.
We appreciate David and Joani being in conversation with us today, and for our listeners for tuning in to the Life Together podcast. To listen to previous episodes, you can find them at our website, firstonfifth.org, or wherever you get your podcast. Please join us again as we explore life together.